The blast of sound tore through the rainy Seattle night. Liam Carter, a former Army special operator turned locksmith and single father, drove his shoulder through a locked door, hearing a desperate cry from within. Black smoke poured from the kitchen. On the floor lay a woman clutching a bleeding wound, her eyes meeting his in a moment of frozen recognition. She was Serena Whitmore, the journalist who had destroyed his military career. In smoke and sirens, their eyes locked. Tonight, to save her, he would have to face the ghosts of his past. The suburbs of Seattle in November were perpetually gray. Rain fell in sheets that seemed to carry no end, drumming against apartment buildings that had seen better days. The complex where Liam rented a modest two-bedroom sat, wedged between a bus route and a community center, home to shift workers, retired tradespeople, and a handful of returning veterans who understood what it meant to rebuild a life after the military had finished with you. The hallways smelled of old carpet and damp concrete. Metal stairs groaned beneath footsteps. Security cameras in the stairwell flickered intermittently, their feeds choppy and unreliable. It was the kind of place where you kept to yourself, where you didn't ask too many questions, where a man could slip into anonymity and call it survival. Liam Carter was 36 years old, though the lines around his eyes suggested a harder lived experience. His frame was lean and efficient, his movements precise, honed by a decade of military service that had trained every instinct into something almost reflexive. He worked as a locksmith and handyman, the kind of man who could fix almost anything in a building with his eyes half closed. It was honest work, quiet work, the kind that didn't demand explanations. But Liam had also made himself the unofficial first responder for the complex. When tenants called about pipe bursts or electrical issues at 2 in the morning, Liam answered. When kids got locked out of apartments, Liam opened the doors. It was a way of being useful that didn't require a uniform or a chain of command. 8-year-old Audrey was the only light in his life that he allowed to fully shine. His daughter possessed an unsettling empathy for someone so young, a way of looking at you that made you want to be better. She noticed things other people missed. She understood that her father carried something heavy that had nothing to do with the tool belt he wore. On the 3rd floor, something new had begun to worry the quiet of the building. Residents had started to notice a man watching the hallway outside apartment 305, the same man lingering by the elevator, checking his phone, then checking again. Elevator camera footage caught fragments of a face, always obscured, always angled away. The tenants whispered about it the way people do when danger is still abstract, still something happening to someone else. Serena Whitmore lived in that apartment. She was 33 and lived in perpetual motion. Even when sitting still, her mind worked like a machine sorting evidence, cataloging details, building narratives out of scattered facts. 5 years ago, she had been a celebrated investigative journalist, the kind whose byline carried weight, whose stories toppled politicians and reformed policies. But 5 years ago, she had also made a choice that she could never undo. She had published a story about Operation Harrier, a covert military operation that had gone wrong. The story was devastating, the sources compelling, the narrative airtight. Except it wasn't. Over the following months, as she dug deeper, as inconsistencies began to surface and her sources started to recant, she realized the horrible truth. She had been fed a narrative by someone with an agenda. Someone had used her platform, her credibility, and her dedication to truth as a weapon. The fallout had been catastrophic. A good man had taken his own life. His name was George Mason. He had been Liam Carter's best friend and fellow operator. The blame fell everywhere and nowhere, but among certain circles, it fell on the journalist who had written the first domino. Serena had been destroyed professionally. Publications that had courted her dropped her quietly. Editors who had praised her work returned her calls with excuses. She had tried to apologize, tried to recant, tried to explain that she too had been deceived, but the damage was already written into the permanent record of the internet. So she had disappeared into hiding, chasing the real story. And that real story had led her to Dante Cross. Cross was a contractor, a businessman in the space where the private security industry blurred into the shadow world of military equipment procurement. He had built an empire of shell companies and front operations, bleeding money from defense contracts and selling secrets to the highest bidder. When Serena began to suspect that Cross had orchestrated the entire Operation Harrier exposure, that he had deliberately fed her false information to eliminate a threat to one of his operations, she had started to gather evidence. An encrypted hard drive, handwritten notes, voice recordings of conversations where Cross's voice could be heard, discussing how to manipulate a journalist into doing his dirty work. She kept this evidence hidden. She moved through the city like a ghost, staying nowhere long enough to establish a pattern. And then, in desperation, she had moved into this building under an assumed name. The man watching from the hallway didn't know where she was yet, but it was only a matter of time. She could feel it in the way her hands shook now, in the way she checked the locks 3 times before bed, in the way she had befriended the 8-year-old girl she sometimes saw on the stairs because Audrey had an innocence that made the fear temporarily recede. Audrey had given Serena a bandage one afternoon. A personal bandage, decorated with cartoon characters, pulled from a box in the apartment downstairs. For when you hurt your hand, the girl had said, her eyes knowingly solemn. Audrey had a way of seeing through to the truth of things that most adults had forgotten how to perceive. Liam didn't know any of this yet. He knew Serena had moved into 305 2 months ago. He knew something was wrong from the way she moved, quick and careful, always watching. He knew enough not to ask questions. But on the evening when the smell of burning plastic and overheated metal began to seep through the apartment complex, when the fire alarm started to wail, Liam's instincts overrode his grudges, and he moved. The electrical fire in Serena's kitchen had started as a small pop, a faulty connection in the range hood, wiring that had degraded over years of the building's quiet decline. But in seconds, it became something else. The spark caught the dish towel. The dish towel ignited the accumulated grease on the stove. The heat spread. Smoke rolled out of the apartment and into the hallway like a living thing. Serena had tried to fight it, but her hand slipped on the burning stovetop, and she went down hard, the impact opening a deep cut across her palm. Liam was on the 4th floor when the alarm sounded. He moved down the stairs in 3 seconds. He saw the smoke. Every signal his body had trained to recognize screamed at him. Fire, danger, move. He smelled the sharp tang of burning plastic and ozone. His ears picked up the hiss of electrical current, the angry crackle of spreading flames. These were triggers that could sometimes send him spiraling into moments he didn't control. Memories of desert operations and buildings that came apart in ways that couldn't be unseen. But right now, his training was all that mattered. Right now, he was exactly what he needed to be. He used a wooden shim to force the lock just enough. His shoulder hit the door with the kind of force that comes from a body that knows how to break things open. The door gave. The smoke was thick and black, vision dropping to 3 feet, but Liam had trained to operate in exactly this condition. He didn't hesitate. He forced himself low, below the worst of the smoke, and moved into the apartment using the geometry of the space, like a man reading a map he had memorized. Serena was on the kitchen floor, gasping, her hand bleeding. Liam moved to her, his voice dropping into the calm, clipped commands of someone used to directing people through crisis. Low. Stay low. Cover your face. He pulled a jacket from the living room, wrapped her head and shoulders, and cradled her like a man carrying something precious and fragile. His other hand turned off the breaker at the panel muscle memory from 100 apartment calls. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from the hallway and discharged it into the kitchen in a practice sweep. Then grabbed the fire blanket from the bathroom and suffocated the remaining flames with mechanical precision. The smoke was still thick. He could feel his pulse accelerating. That old sensation of the world narrowing down to survival. But he kept moving. He pulled her toward the window, broke the glass seal on the fire escape, and they stumbled out into the cold November air. Behind them, the apartment coughed black smoke into the Seattle night. Around them, neighbors emerged in their confusion and fear. Someone was already calling 911. Sirens wailed closer. It was in that moment, as Liam set Serena down on the metal landing of the fire escape, as his hands moved over her to assess the wound and check for burns, that she looked up at him. Her eyes were still streaming with tears from the smoke. Her mouth was open to speak. And then recognition hit her like a physical thing. The color drained from her face. You're Liam Carter?" Liam's body went still. For a long moment, he didn't move. Something passed behind his eyes, rage, recognition. All the weight of a past he had tried to bury and contain. His jaw clenched. Every muscle in his body seemed to tense at once. But beneath it all, beneath the anger and the betrayal, and the still open wound of George Mason's death, something else moved. Something that was still trained to protect, still built to save. He didn't look away from her face. He didn't make her apologize or beg, or explain. Instead, he simply continued to do what needed to be done. He examined the cut on her hand. He pulled off his own shirt to reveal a tank top underneath and used it as a bandage, wrapping her hand carefully, efficiently, like a man who had learned to prioritize function over emotion. "Don't talk," he said quietly. His voice was controlled, everything pushed down into some deep place where it couldn't be seen. "Just breathe. Help's coming." The police arrived within minutes. Clinton Reed, Liam's friend from his own complicated walk through the darkness, was riding patrol that night. Clinton saw the scene and immediately understood what had happened. The fire department rolled in with their professional competence. Neighbors in the hallway had recorded videos clips that would later surface everywhere, showing the moment Liam had crashed through the door, the dedication with which he had fought the fire, the way he had carried an injured woman down the escape route, like she mattered to him more than anything else. Serena was taken to the hospital for observation and treatment of her wound. 37 stitches would eventually line the cut on her palm, a scar that would stay with her as a permanent reminder. As she lay on the ambulance stretcher, she kept trying to speak, to explain, to apologize, but Liam had turned away. He was talking to Clinton, giving the official report, his voice stripped of everything but the necessary facts. When the ambulance pulled away, he stood in the rain and watched it go. And Clinton watched him. And something passed between them that didn't need to be said. In the hospital, Serena lay awake in the dark and thought about the fact that the man she had helped to destroy had just saved her life. The irony was so perfect, so complete, that it almost seemed crafted by something larger than chance. She had spent 5 years running from consequences that she deserved, and they had finally caught up to her not in the form of punishment, but in the form of mercy. It made no sense. It couldn't be reconciled. The night of the fire, Liam sat in his apartment with Audrey asleep on his shoulder and thought about the ocean. He thought about how rage was like drowning if you didn't let yourself get pulled all the way under. If you kept fighting and clawing, you could sometimes make it back to shore. But George Mason hadn't fought hard enough. Or maybe he had fought too hard, against an enemy that couldn't be seen. An enemy that wasn't visible in the physical world. The investigation into Operation Harrier had concluded that George had taken his own life. Nobody could prove otherwise. Nobody could prove that the relentless media coverage, the blame that fell on a team that had been following orders, had been anything but a tragic sequence of events. Except Serena was still out there. Except she was wounded. Except she knew something, because the way she had looked at him on that fire escape wasn't the look of a woman surprised to see a stranger. It was the look of a woman seeing her own sins reflected back at her. Liam didn't go to the hospital. Instead, he called Clinton and asked if there was any word about why the journalist had been living in the building. Clinton, carefully neutral, asked what Liam knew, and when Liam didn't answer, Clinton understood. They had been through enough together to know how to read silence. On the following morning, Serena left a note under Liam's door. She had written it by hand, her handwriting shaky from pain and lack of sleep. "I have evidence," it read. "I know what really happened. I know who destroyed Operation Harrier. Let me help. I can prove it." There was an address written below a small cafe 2 blocks away. Liam read the note 3 times. Then he burned it in the sink and told himself it didn't matter. He had a daughter to raise. He had a life to live that didn't include the woman who had thrown a grenade into his world. But even as he thought this, he knew it was a lie. She was now part of his world whether he wanted her to be or not. The fire had seen to that. The knowledge that she possessed whatever it was had lodged itself inside his mind like an infection he couldn't ignore. He didn't go to the cafe that day. but he asked Clinton to stop by and observe discreetly. Clinton called back within an hour. "She's scared," he said simply. "More than scared. There's a man watching her from across the street. Same man who's been flagged by 3 different residents in your building." The picture was becoming clearer. The question was no longer whether to help her. The question was, what would happen if he didn't? That night, someone tried to force Serena's apartment lock. The scratches were fresh, the marks deliberate. The security camera in the hallway had been angled down toward the floor, a perfect view of nothing. She had called 911, and officers had come, and had found nothing taken, nothing broken, except the attempt itself. That was when Liam made his decision. He went to her apartment the next evening, after Audrey was asleep at a neighbor's house, and he sat across from Serena in the living room and listened. She told him about Dante Cross. She told him about the encrypted hard drive and the voice recordings and the email chains that proved Cross had deliberately engineered the false intelligence that led to Operation Harrier being exposed. She told him that Cross had a network people inside the government, people inside the media, people everywhere, and that he had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep Serena from speaking the truth. She had been running for 3 years, living in cars, sleeping in libraries, gathering evidence in every city she passed through. "I was a fool," she said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking. "I was ambitious and careless, and I wanted to believe I was uncovering truth, but I let someone use that against me, and people paid the price." Liam listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rage or accuse. He simply listened while she told him how George Mason had written her a letter before he died. A letter where George forgave her. A letter where George said he understood that she had been used, that he bore her no grudge, that he hoped she would find a way to live with what had happened. George was the kind of man who could forgive anything. It was one of the things that had made him unbearable to lose. "I'm going to help you," Liam said finally. "Not for you. For George. And for everyone else whose lives got twisted because of Cross." He stood up, and Serena stood with him. "But if I'm doing this, we do it right. We don't go to the police until we have everything. We don't take chances. We protect my daughter, and when this is finished, you disappear out of our lives. You understand?" Serena nodded. She understood completely. What followed was a careful orchestration of security measures that would have impressed a military planner. Serena gave Liam access to the encrypted hard drive. The password was 2-layered. The first keyword, something she had taken from overhearing Audrey on the stairs, the girl's name. It cracked the first seal. The second was a string of numbers that only Serena and one other person knew. Inside was everything: email chains, financial records, voice recordings of Dante Cross, describing how to manipulate a young journalist into doing his dirty work, copies of forged intelligence, money trails that led from Cross's front companies into government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Liam knew a person who knew a person who knew how to create 3 encrypted backups of this data. One went into a safety deposit box at the bank. One went to Clinton Reed, who timestamp sealed it in an evidence locker with official documentation. The third went to a lawyer that Liam trusted. Someone who specialized in cases that required a kind of discretion that couldn't be publicly known. "If anything happens to us," Liam told Serena, "this goes everywhere. Media outlets, federal agencies, everyone. He can't stop all of it." The reality of what they were doing settled over them like a weight. Someone was actively hunting Serena. Someone with resources and connections. The man in the hallway had been identified as an enforcer on Cross's payroll. Someone with a history of intimidation and violence. They were no longer just gathering evidence. They were now in motion against a force that had demonstrated it was willing to use lethal means to protect its secrets. Audrey became an anchor point between them. The girl had a way of cutting through the tension in the apartment with observations that were somehow both innocent and deeply wise. When Serena would begin to panic about whether they were doing the right thing, Audrey would appear with her small flashlight, a gift from a birthday party months before, and offer it to her. "For when it's dark," the girl would say. Liam would watch this small exchange, and something inside him would shift. He couldn't hate Serena while watching his daughter offer her light. One evening, Audrey asked Serena a question that neither of them had prepared for. "Are you scared of the dark?" she asked, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor. Serena hesitated, then nodded honestly. "Yes. Very much." "That's okay," Audrey said. "Lots of people are, but light is always there if you look for it. Even really small light. Even just a little bit." She pressed the flashlight into Serena's hands. "You can borrow this." Liam watched them, and he felt something in his chest that he had locked away for a long time. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was movement in that direction. It was the beginning of understanding that redemption wasn't something that happened at a moment. It was something that had to be built, day after day, choice after choice. The night they decided to move came with rain that seemed biblical in its intensity. The building lost power at 9:30 in the evening. The fire department responded to reports of electrical issues in the basement. The stairwell lights went dark. Security cameras went offline. This was when the second team moved in. 2 men with crowbars and chemical irritants came up the stairwell. They had been paid to retrieve a computer drive, and anyone who got in the way was a secondary concern. They knew Serena had information. They didn't know that Liam had spent the last week preparing for exactly this scenario. They didn't know that a former special operations soldier had scouted every exit and planned contingencies and maintained discipline even when his heart was telling him to simply wait by the door and handle this with direct violence. Liam moved Serena and Audrey to a secondary exit route that used the building's fire escape and an old maintenance passage that led to the adjacent building's basement. He carried supplies, water, a charged flashlight, an emergency medical kit. He carried the knowledge of 100 hostile environments compressed into the way he moved through the dark building. Behind them, the men from Cross's organization began to breach apartment 305. They found it empty. They found a laptop with a decoy file that would later be traced to their operation. And then, Clinton Reed and 2 uniformed officers arrived with a wellness check that had been scheduled by Liam 48 hours in advance. The men fled before the police entered the building. By the time they reached the ground floor, they were pinned by officers. One tried to run through the parking lot and was tackled by Clinton, who had been a linebacker in college and had never forgotten how to hit something. The other went peacefully, understanding that his entire operation was now compromised. In the basement of the adjacent building, Liam held Audrey on his hip, while Serena sat on an old workbench, breathing in the measured way that came from panic management techniques that Liam had taught her. When the crisis passed, when they knew the men were in custody, Liam spoke quietly into his phone to Clinton and provided a full account. "I have evidence that will need to be documented," he said. "Copies. Multiple locations. Cross is going to want to contain this, but he's going to fail because the containment net is too big. What happened over the next 72 hours would be the kind of thing that would be discussed in newsrooms and law enforcement agencies for years afterward." Serena decided that the best defense was to make everything public before Cross could bury it. She arranged a live stream through a platform that couldn't be taken down. It was scheduled for 4 in the morning, when the traffic on such platforms was lowest and the algorithm was least likely to catch the signal. Clinton helped her set up redundancies. Everything was routed through encrypted channels. Everything was designed to spread faster than Cross's considerable influence could suppress. The location she chose was Cross's own operations center, the shipping warehouse at Pier 27, where Cross had run his enterprise for 7 years without serious interference. Liam objected strenuously. Going to Cross was walking directly into the teeth of the beast, but Serena was clear-eyed about what needed to happen. "He needs to know it's me," she said. "He needs to see it. If I do this from hiding, it's just data. But if I confront him directly, if I make it real, then the people watching will understand that this isn't conspiracy theory. It's testimony from the person he tried to destroy." So they made a plan. Clinton provided unmarked police vehicles. Liam positioned himself on the roof of an adjacent warehouse with sightlines into the entire pier. Serena, wired with a small microphone that would pick up every word, entered the main warehouse at 3:50 in the morning. Dante Cross was there waiting. He had received an anonymous message telling him where to be and when. He hadn't known it was a trap. He thought he was being summoned to finalize something. The arrogance of a man who had hidden in the system his entire life is a specific thing. It's a belief that the system will always protect you, that the rules written for common people don't apply to the wealthy and well-connected. Cross stood in the center of his own empire and didn't understand that it was already crumbling. Serena walked toward him out of the darkness, and she was no longer afraid. The live stream was running. Thousands of people who knew her reputation, who understood her skill as an investigator, were watching. She had positioned the camera on a support beam where it had a clear view of both of them. "Hello, Dante," she said, and her voice carried the weight of 3 years of running and gathering evidence and planning this exact moment. "We need to talk about who orchestrated Operation Harrier." What followed was a confrontation where truth met denial, where documentation met lies. Serena laid out the email chains, the payment records, the voice recordings where Cross could be heard describing his manipulation. Cross tried at first to deny everything. Then he tried to offer her money. Then, as it became clear that the confrontation was being broadcast and watched by increasing numbers of people, he made a statement that sealed his fate. He spoke about how he had managed the journalist using his exact word, caught on the live stream to serve his purposes. He described it like she was a tool, a means to an end, no different from a computer or a bank account. In that moment, the court of public opinion turned decisively. Within minutes, multiple independent journalists had begun to verify the information being presented. Other news outlets picked up the stream. Federal agencies that had been waiting for exactly this kind of public demonstration began to move. By the time the sun came up, Cross was in custody, and the infrastructure of his operation was collapsing like a house with no foundation. The fire that broke out in the warehouse was technically an accident. An electrical malfunction in a storage area, the kind of thing that happens in old industrial buildings, but it spread fast and hot. The evacuation order came through, and Serena was moving toward the exit when the smoke thickened suddenly, unexpectedly. She lost her bearing. The containment area around the storage room had seemed to move, to shift. And now, the path that she had memorized was obscured by toxic black clouds. That was when Liam came down from the roof. He moved through smoke that would have incapacitated most people, guided by a kind of sixth sense that came from a lifetime of operating in exactly these conditions. He wrapped her in his jacket, covered her mouth and nose, and carried her out of the building with the efficiency of a man who had done this before, who had carried wounded soldiers out of burning compounds and collapsing buildings in situations that most people couldn't imagine surviving. He emerged into the cool pre-dawn air, and Serena was coughing, sobbing, but alive. Audrey was waiting with Clinton, and when she saw them emerge, she ran forward and threw her arms around them both. The fire department arrived and contained the blaze. The federal agents swarmed the scene and secured the evidence. Dante Cross was already under formal arrest. The subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of what he had done, not just Operation Harrier, but 3 other military operations that had been compromised, dozens of government contracts that had been stolen, an entire shadow economy of corruption that had been operating in the spaces between official oversight. The rehabilitation of Liam Carter's reputation happened slowly, but with total finality. The military issued a full exoneration and a formal apology to his family. George Mason's family received the same, along with a public statement acknowledging that their son's career had been destroyed through deliberate disinformation. The policy changes that resulted from the exposure of Cross's operation would be studied in military academies and law enforcement training for decades to come. Serena's redemption was more complicated. She couldn't undo the harm she had caused, but she could live with intention going forward. She published a lengthy investigative piece titled "The Journalist I Used to Be," where she documented her own exploitation and the way that ambition without wisdom had made her a tool for someone else's corruption. The piece won awards, but more importantly, it spawned a movement within journalism about verification protocols and source protection that made it harder for the next Dante Cross to operate in darkness. She used the proceeds from a book deal to establish the Mason Foundation, which provided scholarships to military children and funded community centers in neighborhoods like the one where she had met Liam. Liam began to teach. He developed a training program called Survivor Skills that taught basic emergency response and self-defense to teenagers and retired veterans. He started it in the community center where he lived, in that same gray building where the smoke had poured from apartment 305. Audrey helped him organize it. Clinton volunteered as an instructor, and Serena, in ways that deepened gradually over time, became part of the community that formed around the program. A year after the warehouse confrontation, Liam and Audrey invited Serena to go camping. It was a small thing. A weekend at a state park about an hour north of the city. Liam taught Audrey how to build a fire safely. They cooked dinner over flames that danced and held the darkness at bay. In the evening, as they sat by the water's edge watching the sun descend toward the horizon, Audrey handed Serena the small flashlight. It had traveled through everything with them: the fire, the escape, the confrontation, the aftermath. "You don't need this anymore," Audrey said. "But you can keep it, so you remember that light is real. Even when it's dark, light is real." Serena took the flashlight and held it in her hands like it was something precious and fragile. She looked at Liam, and he met her eyes with something that was no longer rage or betrayal or resistance. It was understanding. It was the knowledge that forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing to build something new from the wreckage. It's about recognizing that the people who hurt us and the people we become are sometimes the same people, transformed by consequence and choice and the daily decision to be better. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past," Liam said quietly, "but it gives the future a chance." And Serena nodded, because she understood that this was the most generous thing he could offer. Not forgetting. Not pretending that Operation Harrier hadn't happened, that George Mason was still alive, that 3 years of running and fear could be erased, but choosing, despite all of that, to build something forward. To become people who were capable of light in the darkness. Even when the darkness had once seemed absolute, they sat by the water as the sun set and turned the sky into gold and crimson and deep purple. The flashlight sat on the rock between them, glowing softly, a small beacon in the gathering dusk. And in that moment, watching the light push back the darkness, they understood that some kinds of rescue require not just physical extraction, but the willingness to be saved, to accept mercy, to believe that redemption is possible even for those who have broken things that seemed unbreakable. The night was coming, but they were no longer afraid of it. They had found their way back to each other through fire and smoke, and all the ways that humans hurt and forgive, survive.